This is an interview with Tom Foxwell for the Valley Historical Preservation Project. The interviewer is myself, Margaret Foxwell. The date is March 19th, and the location is in our home here in Elgin. Tom, what is your full name?
Thomas Harris Foxwell.
When were you born?
I was born in 1914, December 30th, 1914.
What?
Up at the Hilaria Township and on the farm where we used to live.
Where were your parents born?
My father was born in the same place where I was. He was born 3 years, I guess, after they came here from Wisconsin. My grandfather came from near Penzance in England, and came to Wisconsin first, and then came to Elyria. But my grandfather, he was also Thomas Harris Foxwell. He came over in the 1840s and settled around Racine, Wisconsin. And then his wife died. His first wife did. He went back to England to settle some affairs then. The story was that he went back to see if he could get another sister to the first wife, but they wouldn't let him have another one to come to this wild country. That's just a story. But he
Came back in 49.
when he came back in 49, then he farmed there in Racine, Wisconsin area, and he married my grandmother there. And in 1863 they came to the farm in Elyria. Lived in a log house there for several years. It was, his mother, my grandfather's mother, came to Wisconsin with him too, and they lived there. So I guess I'll leave that alone.
What about your mother? Where did you...
My mother was Elizabeth Humphrey. She and her parents were James Thomas Saunders Humphrey and Grace John. Her mother was Grace Johns. They came to this country in about 1880. My mother was 3 years old at the time when they came.
Why did they leave England?
I don't know why they left England. The conditions were very bad over there. Taxes were terribly high, and the state church was oppressive and taxing the people, and they were Methodist people too, and they wanted to come here for freedom more than anything else, I think. So.
Were your parents neighbors before they were married?
My mother's people settled on a farm just about half mile west of where we lived, our farm. And the story was Grandfather came over here, Grandfather Humphrey came over here beforehand. He bought that farm on a handshake, went back to England and told Grandmother they were coming to America. And she thought that was a splendid idea because she wanted to get him out of England too. And they had 11 children. They all came and settled in that place in 1880.
In the home community where you were born, you remained there, and where did you go to school?
I went to the same school that my parents had gone to, as the oldest school in Elyria Township. I'm sure probably the oldest school in the county at that time, because I think it was built in about 1850. So my parents both went to the same school. It was an interesting building. It's very small, but it mostly tore it down later on. Practically every brick had initials of some kid who went to school there. carved in it.
Was that the only school?
That school was there until about 1939, I suppose, 38. They closed it down for a year, and then they built a new school after that. And that new school was a frame building, quite a nice modern building. But after they closed schools, and a few years later, they moved that down here to Elgin, and it's now down the eastern end of Franklin Street. It's a residence.
Realize your oldest son also went to that school. When you finished, tell us about those awful 8th grade tests.
Tests where the rural children, pupils had their tests took their tests in the schoolhouse with just their teacher. We took ours there. We had 2 opportunities to take this test. As I recall, we took them in the evening after school was out with just the teacher in attendance. And first, if you didn't pass the first time, you had a chance again. In one case, we had when my sister was taking hers, one of the boys was having kind of little trouble getting all the answers, and the teacher's brother had come to pick her up, and she was through with. And he sat there and almost drove the teacher crazy because he was giving the answers to this boy that was having a little difficulty. The boy passed, and everything was fine.
Then you went to high school?
I went to high school here in Elgin. We had the largest class that had been in school at that time. 31. We started out with 33 in school. 3 of them dropped out, and we added 1 more later on. So we graduated 31 in 1933.
Do you have any favorite teachers that you remember?
Teachers were never my favorite, I don't think, but we had one, Miss Crow, that everyone that went to school in Elgin remembered her as a teacher who made you learn whether you wanted to or not. Maybe that was a good thing for all of us. So,
were you out for any sports or other activities?
I didn't go out for any sports. I was walking to school, and I guess we did have chores at home, and I went home for those. But I did go out for the band for a while. I sang in Glee Club and did all kinds of, was in some plays and things like this, but I wasn't out for much of anything in the way of athletics.
Clean the field.
But I did used to go up in the ball games. Football games were in the afternoon, the last period of school, on to the later afternoon, and my job was to go up and clean the field off from the cow pasture before the boys played on it.
You walked to school. That was quite a ways. Field woods.
We came down in the wintertime. We came down through our timber. There was a road down through there that just for the horse and wagon and sleds, and there was much more very nice walking in there compared to the road because it was down through the timber and it was comfortable out of the wind. This road came out halfway down to Elgin, so it sheltered us quite a bit.
Did others go that way?
Well, some of us that walked to school did some of the time. We didn't go that way all the time, but it was in wintertime when there was quite often a good track there because the whole neighborhood used this road as a means to get to town with their sleds and that in wintertime. Winters then were quite, some of them were quite severe. There were times when the road was closed for 3 weeks at a time. No one came they can't see this. No one came to the on the road except the mailman. The mailman then, he didn't make it every day, but sometimes when he did come, he walked.
When you graduated from school, then what? Did you go back to farming?
Yes, my father was quite elderly. I was his youngest, and he was not young when he was married, and he was practically blind by the time before I started high school. So the farm was put into it was rented out at that time. So then after I graduated from high school, then I took over with the farm and stayed there until my father died in 1936, and then my younger sister and I stayed on there until till my mother died in 1943. So then the war was on, and we decided, there are other men who were being drafted with families, and I had no obligations to anyone, so I decided to go and service myself. I joined the Navy then. Spent 2 years there. During that time, we took part in the invasion of Okinawa, and then after the war was over, we went up to Incheon in Korea as an occupation force there. We were in the amphibious Navy, landing part of the Navy, so that's a long story. We won't bother with that.
You were discharged when?
Discharged in, I think, April of 1946. And I came home then, and then at that time I found a lovely lady and married her on the 11th of August in 1946. We took a short honeymoon trip out to the West Coast. We had relatives out there to visit on the way, and people we hadn't seen for a while. We had this opportunity to do this, so we took this and did it then. Had a good time. We were 5 weeks in a honeymoon. Wonder why we came home so soon.
You came home, and then did you go back to the farm?
After we came home, then we lived in the rented house in West Union, close to Margaret's people, her folks, and stayed there until the next March, and then we moved back onto the farm.
And how long have you been married now?
Oh, well, we've been married 52 years about now, but in 2 years ago we had quite a celebration for our 50th anniversary. We have a cabin back in the woods on our farm, and our whole family was there to help us celebrate this on the Saturday of this celebration time. And then on the next day, we had an open house at the Elyria Church, and that was quite an event too, because I think we had 300 and some registered. That stretching it just a little, I guess. But
Elyria Church is your church?
The Elyria Church was just up the road from our farm, about a quarter of a mile east of our farm. And that's been a real strong institution there in our neighborhood. While I was growing up, that was the main center of everything in the community. This church was used for everything from weddings and funerals and get-togethers of all kinds of farm bureau and all these things. And it was really a center of the social center of the community.
It was built in...
The church was built in 1894. And it is a community church. It's non-denominational, but we are served by a Methodist pastor in cooperation with St. Paul's here in Elgin.
Have you always lived on the farm up on 56?
Well, after I came home and started farming there, we lived there for 10 years. And then, after 10 years I had a problem with an injury I'd had before in service, and I had to stop this, and the doctors insisted that I should have an operation on my neck, but they changed their mind, and they put me in school in college at Upper Iowa University. I spent 4 years there. Came out with a bachelor's degree, and then I had taught for a year. I taught a year out to Rockford, Iowa. We moved to Rudd for a year. That's the only time we'd been away from the farm. Then after a year of teaching there, we taught at Rockford, Iowa. But came back here and taught in the Central School. I taught art and industrial arts in these schools. Taught for 13 years.
What classes, what ages did you teach?
Well, I taught high school for part of the time, and junior high part of the time, and then we had elementary is part of it too. That's kind of hard to explain.
Junior high.
I did.
Looking back, Father, as you were younger, do you have some distinct childhood memories of what you did, where you went?
We didn't go anywhere, really. The first time I ever went anywhere with any distance was when I was in high school. One summer, my father wanted to go back to Wisconsin, where the rest of the people had come from, where the rest of the family had come from. And so we took a trip out there, and that's the first time I'd ever gone anywhere at all like that. So it was a new experience for us then. But I really never traveled much. Just one time I thought about it. I'd been to, when I came home from service, I'd been in 38 states, but I'd never been to Minnesota, and that was 30 miles away.
You took a long honeymoon. Skip down to Elgin. You've always lived around here, and now we live here. Do you remember much about the stores? Did you come often?
We seldom came to Elgin. Children seldom came to Elgin because until I came to high school, I really didn't know much about Elgin. I think that's quite typical of a lot of people at that time. But we used to come to Elgin. Elgin was a hometown, and bring their eggs down here and trade for the groceries and things like this, like everyone else did.
Did you tell us about the road, 56?
The 56 was quite a just more of a trail when I was just a boy, but because it was laid on an old Indian trail, I guess, along the ridge between West Union and Elgin. And it was very crooked a lot of places, but up where we lived, it was quite a level stretch of land there, right on the top of a ridge between the Turkey and the Volga River. And so we had a real nice straight road past our house, but most of it was very crooked. But when I was quite small, or quite young, they worked the road. That was really quite a thing in its day. They made all the grades with wagons and with horses and mules. Had one big old Caterpillar tractor that filled these wagons, and that's the only piece of engine equipment they had. All the rest were horses and mules. And it took 2 years to work that section past our place. They had camps there where they had tents to put their mules and horses in, and some of the people lived in some abandoned, empty houses that were there, and some of them just had movable shacks that they lived in. It's quite a thing to watch for a young boy.
Did they have cook wagons, food wagons?
Oh, I don't know. I think they had their families were quite often there. I can't recall it all now.
Do you remember when you first had a covering of gravel or what?
They gravelled the road after that. After they worked at that time, they put a coat of gravel on it. They had a rock crusher over there south of where we lived, southwest of where we lived, and it ran for 24 hours a day, all the time, crushing rock. And they hauled this with little bits of dump trucks that looked like toys nowadays. But I was quite a young boy when they were doing that, and my parents told me, "Don't you ever dare to ride with those people." But I one day went over to watch them crush rock, and on the way back, one of the truckers stopped, asked if I wanted to ride, and of course, naturally I got in with him. I'd come to find out afterwards, the fellow had been working for 3 shifts, a day and a half that had been, and he went to sleep and drove off the side of the road, and the truck tipped upside down, and I jumped out of the one side of the truck and landed on the other side of it. And the truck was upside down in the ditch, and I jumped up scared and ran for home, and it's about time to go get the cows, so I ran right through the yard, never stopped at all for hear somebody to ask where I'd been. I went back to get the cows, and when I got over there, I could see where the truck, across to where the truck had tipped over, and they just tipped it back onto the road, and my, there was smoke all over the place.
How was the driver?
The driver came crawling out underneath. There was no cab on the trucks, but it's miraculous that neither one of us got hurt. But he came out all dripping with gasoline and battery acid and everything else. But the first thing he said, "Are you all right?" At that, I jumped up and I was gone. But it was a day or so before I admitted to my folks what happened.
When the road was still mud, do you ever remember it being planked so traffic could get through, or didn't cars try?
The first time it worked, when I was telling you this, after they'd gravelled it, the next spring after that, they had planks putting it half the way from West Union down, because the bottom went out of these roads. And so we when you did drive on that, you had to drive on those planks. And then later on, before they paved it, after we were married, They reworked it then for the paving, and did a lot of work that time. That same thing happened then. They had it planned.
Did you have a car? Did you try to drive a car?
Well, my father got a car in 1918. He came down here to Elgin and Halbert Knutson and ran a garage here, and he sold Overland cars. So my father was quite mechanically minded. Halbert took him out for a ride, and they drove around a little, and finally Halbert said, "Well, Steve, I'll take you home and show you how to come out tomorrow and show you how to drive it." And my father said, "Well, I guess I'll just drive it home," and he did. And he never had any trouble with it at all. But my mother decided she would learn to drive one time later on. And she started out from our place, drove up east to past the church, was about a quarter of a mile east of us. Just as she went over the hill, here was a car coming the other way. She pulled up on the steering wheel and said, "Whoa, we'll stop here." And that's as far as she ever drove. So.
How'd she get the car home?
Oh, my father was along.
I see.
She wasn't alone. No, goodness, no. She never drove after that.
What would you tell us about the threshing rings?
Well, thrashing was a great thing, and when I was a boy, the whole neighborhood thrashed together. And so Tommy Ogle had the thrashing machine for our area, and we'd start one end of the neighborhood, work our way to the other end. Usually, it was quite an event, because the biggest work was for the cooks, I think, preparing the meals for the thrashers. But each cook tried to outdo the other one, and we ate like horses. But it was a good fun time for everyone. But it always came at thrashing came at fair time, and fair was a big thing at that time. So usually they'd take off a day during the fair. If the weather wasn't too bad, we'd take off a day, and if the weather hadn't been pressing them too much, they'd take off a day and everybody go to the fair up to West Union.
Tell us about the fair. Did you show anything?
No, I never did. We usually try to go to the fair one day a year. That's about all we ever would go. We were quite a ways out of town. We didn't go to the fair very much. But it was a great thing. You'd have a nickel or two to spend, and that's about it.
Did you go for all day?
Oh, usually.
As a family?
Oh, yes. We used to quite often take a picnic dinner to go to the fair when I was small. It was I can't tell a great deal about the fair, but.
What did you do for entertainment? Was there any specific entertainment?
Well, the neighborhood.
Movies?
No.
Any traveling?
The main entertainment I recall in our neighborhood was centered around the church. The church was the meeting place for everything, and there was a great deal that went on there. They had Farm Bureau meetings regularly, and they had all kinds of things happening there. But every year the community they had a community day that was well known all over the country. People came from all over for that for years, and that was a 3-day event to start with, and turned into a homecoming for the last part of it. People had come from a distance would have that as a homecoming then. Then 4th of July was a big, they usually had a big picnic on the 4th of July when I was a kid. And usually it would be held in some woods or quite often there's one house that was empty at the time. And the whole neighborhood came, they had a nice yard there, and the whole neighborhood would congregate there for a 4th of July picnic, and they'd have a real good time. Then I have vivid memories of the Memorial Days that they used to have. That was a big thing at the church and the cemetery. They had a tremendous crowd come to those things, and they had a little fife and bugle corps that used to play. There's some of the John Schaefer and Mark Klingman and Bob Peters, different ones used to play in that. And they had real stirring music. And when I was just a little fellow, some of the older veterans used to come in their Civil War uniforms even sometimes. And it's too bad that they can't have a little of the meaning that we had then that now.
Elyria still does.
Elyria still has it, but it's not as well attended as it used to be.
What memories do you have of the Depression?
Well, the Depression was tough on a lot of people, but most of us were in about the same boat. People didn't have a great deal, so we didn't miss much. We had plenty to eat. The farmers had their own meat and their milk and eggs, and they fared quite well, but it was very hard on a lot of people. Of course, there were a lot of farms that were lost, that had been overextended with their financing, and it was tough for everyone, but we survived. It was if everyone else is in the same boat, you didn't notice it so much.
Now, you had a big house. How did you heat it? Tell us about that house. It has a lot of history.
House, my grandfather died not too many years after he came to Elyria, and so my grandmother, yes, my grandmother lived there. They lived in a log cabin, and my grandmother lived there with my father and his two sisters. And this was a home for quite a bit of the family. There's many of the others who were married came back there to vacation, and sometimes between jobs they were there. And they lived in that until 1893. And then they built a new house. And this house was a nice big frame house. But and then after my parents were married, they built onto that. Then there was quite a large house then. But it was, by the time we were married, it was starting to get in need of quite a bit of repair. After we'd been there about 3 or 4 or 5 years, we decided to redo it, so we took the top story off of the house and turned it into a one-story ranch-style house. It was turned into a very attractive little house. Afterwards, of course, by that time we had just 2 children, and that was probably all we were going to have. And so after we tore the top story off, we had 2 more. So we had 4 children, and after the children started leaving home, we built onto the house again, so I've always been a step or two behind.
That's the story of the house. Going back to the Depression age, what did you heat with?
Oh, we always, when I was a kid, we heated with wood from the timber. We had a lot of timber on the farm, so we always heated with wood. We had a furnace in the house, and it was very comfortable.
How did you light it?
Oh, in our house we had a acetylene gas plant lighted, but we didn't use that an awful lot. We used mostly kerosene lamps, but the acetylene was mostly for company times, things like this. We used it quite a little, but not altogether.
When did you get electricity? Did that change the lifestyle?
Well, we had, some of the neighbors had electric plants. The ones across the road had an electric plant, batteries, but that went on until about 1938, I think it was. Then REC came in and they built a line through there and lit up the whole country. This is a real lifesaver for the rural area everywhere. The first thing that people did is just have lights and maybe buy a flat iron or something like this, and a few of them got a refrigerator, but at home we didn't have a refrigerator for quite a while. But they had a flat iron and they put a motor on the washing machine. That's the first thing to do. So, but people were very careful with it. You see, they were allowed, I think, 40 kilowatts of electricity, and they were always afraid they'd run over that, because I think it cost them, what, about $2 to $4 a month or something like that for electricity. That they thought that was an awful lot.
Well, you said some places had electricity. How were they served?
Oh, that was home electric plants.
Oh.
Yes, they had batteries and a generator. But
was there electric power of any other kind
No.
before REC?
no, just
Yes, there was.
oh, there was not in our place, but
No.
down the road there was an electric line that went from Claremont to Wadena and Volga, and the people who were on that line had electricity available, but that was not our. That didn't go past our place.
REC changed a lot of things. Has you think your lifestyle has changed a lot in 83 years?
I should think so. I should think so.
Why did you stay in the area where you live? Did you ever think of leaving it?
No, it was just, I guess that's one of the things we just did. We stayed there. But I didn't go to school past high school. After just the thing that many of them did for a while.
The farm was there.
Farm was there, so that's the way it was.
The farm was 100 years old when?
1863. In 1963, we had a rather interesting celebration there. We were 100 years. The farm was 100 years old then, and so we had a 3-day event, and I don't remember how many people attended this, but we had people from
14 states.
14 states, I
300
guess.
people.
Yes, about 300 people and people from 14 states, and it was quite a quite a celebration.
We had a dinner at the church.
Big dinner at the church there. Covered most everything that time.
Are there any other special memories and events you'd like to talk about?
Well, I think it's pretty time to wind it up. So, Charlie.
I thank you for this interview.
Okay, Bill.
Yes.
Where you going? You're going.
I'm Margaret Foxwell, and I'm going to finish this interview. I was not a native of Elgin area, but I have been here for 52 years, so I feel quite well acquainted. When we moved here 10 years ago, people wondered why we moved here instead of to my hometown, West Union. But I liked Elgin, and I still do. I was born Margaret Fox Tope in May 16, 1921, at Auburn, which is Auburn Township, Fayette County. When I was a year and a half, we moved to Windsor Township on a farm which was 4 miles west of West Union on what they call the old Hawkeye Road, which is a mile south of 18. My parents were Lloyd Tope and Thelma Payne. I have no real near relatives who emigrated, but on my father's side, the Topes and the Ishmans were of German descent. The Topes came into America, as far as I know, in the late 1700s. It's so said that they were butchers, so they probably sold meat to the British. They came to Iowa, my direct line came to Iowa around West Union in 1852. My Grandma Tope's people, the Ishmans, were also of German descent. I can't really tell you much about when they came, but I know my grandmother used to talk German, and I do have the Ishman German Bible that would have been belonged to her parents. I can't read it, but it's a German Bible. My mother's family, her father's family name was Payne. Mother was the oldest of 7 sisters. They were of French and English ancestry, and we think they came from France through England. The direct line, my DAR membership, was earned on a Revolutionary War veteran in Grandpa's family. Grandma Payne's people, her maiden name was Shepherd, and I don't have much from them. I grew up and started the Windsor No. 6 school. It was called Maryville. It was located maybe half mile from us. It was a standardized school, and standardized schools were something that you strive to be. I think possibly there was more tax money that would come to you to that school if you were standardized. It took some extra effort on the people. We had an active PTA that met monthly and tried to raise money for special things that you had to have if you were standardized school, things like a furnace, a Victrola, an organ, lights, extra books, and it was a little work, but it was a lot of fun to have those monthly PTA meetings at the school where we put on programs and had speeches, and I know we had a little dog that would sing when it heard music, and even Zippy was on a program down there one night because he howled. I thought afterward his ears probably hurt, but we thought he was singing. The director of the school was elected every year, and of course that was important, really, like a presidential election, because all of that was on his shoulders to decide what would be done and who would be hired to teach the school. There were, had those 8th grade tests, and that was always a challenge to the teacher and the pupils. We stayed after school many, many nights. There were 8 of us that graduated from the 8th grade that year, and the teacher would have us stay after school, and we would drill and drill. But we did all pass. It was a scary experience taking those tests because, for as Tom told you, he took his in his school. We had to go to the big school in West Union. And for going there, that was frightening. Most of us had not been to town that much, let alone being in that school. And there we were, sitting in a classroom taking these tests, and the other kids were looking at us, and well, it just wasn't fun. The West Union had a high school normal training class, and those seniors, high school seniors, more or less administered the tests, and I received some help from a cousin that was in there. But country school was fun. I think before I even started, I joined in a maypole dance that they put on down there, and it was outside, and I had to wear a little white dress with white stockings, and oh, my feet got so cold that night. But it's something I never forgot. We had lots of programs, and it always was amazing when you think back on it, how the children, all 8 grades, all those ages, all played together, took care of one another, and I think they really learned from one another. So there were a lot of benefits in the country schools. We had to learn. I'll have to tell a story, and my brother, we used to have to learn the phonics before we could ever learn to read. Like A says A and B says B, and Brother Harold just didn't like that. He'd come to school, Mother'd send him, but he'd get sick as soon as he got there, and one of the older boys would have to walk home with him. Then he'd be fine the rest of the day. So our teacher had to change her method of teaching him. But he learned, in spite of not having to sit through those phonics classes. I was young. I was really young, too young. I regret it to this day, but the teacher in the country school did not want to have one person alone, and she skipped me in some classes. So I was barely 12 when I entered high school.
Right?
I really was the age of those that came in there 2 years later, and that's where most of my friends were, in high school. It was a big school. It was big for standards then, but I seemed to get along all right. We entered with 63 in our class. We graduated 58. And to this day, we still have a reunion every 5 years, and it's surprising how many people come. And at the last reunion, last fall, they said they did not want to wait another 5 years. So we may be having more frequent ones. Harold and I lived 4 miles from town. Now, Harold was a year and a half older, but we were in the same class. About 4 miles. And the first 2 years, we had drove a pony, a horse to school. It was a snappy-looking horse. She trotted. The minute we left the driveway, she set her pace, and in 15 minutes we were there. And Dad always had a nice-looking buggy, and in the wintertime it was a cutter, but it wasn't the way I wanted to travel, because everybody didn't do it that way. We had to put the horse in a livery stable there by the corner of the courtyard square, and walk over. The school was where the junior high school, it's the same one the junior high school has in West Union now. It didn't hurt us any, though, and I know now that many of my friends even rode horses to school, but they had grandparents that kept their horses, who would keep the horses, so I know a lot more about it now, and I needn't have been so embarrassed as I was. The West Union School was giving a normal training class, and they had for I don't know how many years. I know my grandmother used to say she went to Fayette County Normal. I didn't ask questions, I just accepted it. But I've learned since that Fayette County Normal was in the same school that I took the 8th grade tests in. It was right beside the present school up there, right in town, but it's torn down now. Well, I took the normal training, which was a series of classes that were required, cut us out of some of the other classes like the typing, shorthand, and things. But when we've completed that, we were able to graduate with a normal training certificate. We had to take tests to receive that certificate, somewhat similar to what the 8th grade took. It was, you had to be 18, of course, and I was too young to teach for a while. Looking back on my childhood, rural life was fun. It was busy. Everyone had chores to do, and I don't think I was ever bored. But my dad loved animals, and in spite of the Depression, he did indulge us all that he could. We had ponies. The neighbor kids had ponies. We drove them, we rode them, and the ponies even did chores. We had goats, we had rabbits, pets of all kinds. We even had white mice, rats, which I hated. When the Depression was on, of course, but in the country we didn't really know we were poor. My mother always said, well, we didn't know there was a Depression because we didn't have much anyway, but we had plenty to eat. But I remember one time being in a store with my dad, and apparently I wanted something. I don't remember what that was, but I can still hear him tell the clerk, the children just don't understand. I do remember the banks closed, and I lost the money I had in there, which wasn't very much, I guess, but to me it was quite a loss. After 2 years in high school with driving the horse, Brother Harold had a car, so we could enjoy getting to more school and church activities as long as we could get gas for the car. And Brother Harold always said that the man down the road would give him work to do on Saturdays, and he said he thought Richard was hired him just so he could have a little extra money for gas, because we were permitted to go to things quite a bit. And the church went to church camps at Clear Lake, and in those days that people made their own transportation, they took their own food, and we just had a wonderful counselor and many good memories. The fair in our rural life was important. We always took part. Mother would enter her fancy work, and we entered garden produce. We kids would take our pets. They had classifications for rabbits and chickens. And we took our pony, and we sometimes earned extra money selling rides on that pony. There was no such thing as liability insurance or concern about anything like that then. Mother baked pies for the church stands, and she worked in one, and I did too when I was old enough to be responsible there. And sometimes we'd go back in the evenings for the grandstand performances. One night we came home, and there was a can of, I think it was kerosene, sitting in the yard, which was not ours, but a can of gasoline was gone. We went in the house, and the house had been pantry had been ransacked, food was taken, and clothing and blankets. My dad always felt so bad because they took his good suit. we didn't know who it was. The folks were rather inclined to think they were probably some fair workers who maybe wandered out. We never heard. We did call the cop, the sheriff, I think. But we used, at the same time, there was a band of gypsies that would camp south of us. They'd come every year, and I think there was a well over there. It must have been an abandoned homestead. And they'd camp over there. Now the gypsies were, they say they were of the Caucasian race. I think that's western, the mountainous area between Europe and Asia. What they were doing here, I don't know. But they wore very bright garments and lots of jewelry. But we never heard of any thievery in our neighborhood. So we weren't too quick to blame them for break-in on Fair Week. There were gypsies that did travel about, and they did a lot of begging for food, or they would beg for food while someone else was around raiding the homestead for something else they could use. After I graduated from high school, then I taught in the rural schools for 7 years. It was wartime, and when it came time that I would need to renew my certificate, we were able to teach in what they called an emergency certificate, and that was renewed by reading books and feeling extra things like that. The rural school was not a strange thing to me because I had attended one. And I still had to get 8th grade kids ready for tests, same as my teachers had done, and I had them pass, but it was a lot of work. The janitor work was a big chore to the rural school teachers. I think I had furnaces usually. One school had a stove, but it was oil. But the furnaces had to be started, ashes carried out, and that was a terrible job. If you were real good at banking your fire, it sometimes would stay overnight, and the building wouldn't be too cold when you reached there the next morning. Burned wood usually, and sometimes coal. One school I taught was near home, and I stayed at home, and I walked to school. And then it seemed like a bicycle would be a big help. It was pretty much of a couple miles. But you had ration books then. But I did have one, and they did let me get a bicycle, which I rode. The school children during the war gathered scraps of irons. We had a pile in our schoolyard that someone came and picked up. And I think kids gathered milkweeds then. There was a lot done for the war effort. But I still can remember the snowy roads and schoolyards. It's the teacher's job to go out and shovel the paths to the door and to shovel the paths to the toilets. Sometimes you even had to go in there and shovel the snow out. And, well, it was just your job to keep things neat. One time I had some cattails in the schoolhouse. I left them there over Christmas vacation, and I went back, and they had burst. And have you ever tried to clean up cattails with a dust mop? I don't think a vacuum cleaner would have worked any better. I taught the 7 years, and then I would have had to have gone to summer school that summer, but I was married then. And we came down to the farm to live. I didn't go to summer school, but later, probably 14 years later, I shared college experience with Tom somewhat when he started his college. We reviewed English and mythology and other subjects. He even earned an A in golf, but I didn't get to be a part of that. I was busy at home with a 3-year-old with a broken leg, and before the school year, or before the college years ended, we had our daughter. When Tom started teaching, it was that daughter's first year at school. It was our junior high son Jim, his first year in junior high, and Alan's first year at Upper Iowa. So we had a lot of firsts that year. Paul was in third grade, and the kids all graduated from Valley High. They have their happy memories too. We have 4 children. Alan went to Upper Iowa, and following that he taught 4 years in Alaska before coming back here to teach, and most of the remaining years now have been in the Menominee, Wisconsin. He and Sue Seaver have 3 children. Tricia is now through college and working in St. Paul. Jeremy will be graduating this spring and going to an instrument repair school. And Andrew will be entering junior high. Jim attended Kelmer School took interior decoration and worked at Elgin at McTaggart's store until it closed, and since then he has been an independent worker. He now lives in Cedar Rapids, and he has 2 children, Lance, who works in Cedar Rapids, and Megan, who will graduate from the Elgin school this spring. Paul is at attended Iowa State, and is now working for, he's the engineer at the Ellen McKee Clayton REC. They live in Monona, and he and Mary Smith, she was a local girl, have 4 daughters. Monica is the oldest. She's she'll be entering high school this next fall. Stephanie, Rachel, and Lauren. Susan took her further education in the area school in Waterloo in business training, and she now is has been for a number of years at Northwest Airlines. She and her husband are both in computer, which I don't begin to try to understand, but that's what she's in, and she likes it. She and Kelly have 2 boys, Jake and Josh. We've had a happy, successful marriage of 52 years on the farm and here in town of Elgin since we moved here in 1990. And I like Elgin. And I think I will finish this interview by telling you something about the Elgin Historical Society. Since the historical societies are more or less, of the 3 towns, Elgin, Claremont, Wadena, are more or less sponsoring this historical preservation project. And I am presently the president of the Elgin Society. Our society organized in 1984. We met at the Valley Cafe that Bev Frederick was then managing. We met monthly, and our first goal was to do an Elgin history book. Elgin had never had an extensive history, and this is a big book full of history and pictures. We spent 2 years doing that, and we're very happy with it. Much of our success, especially in having our meeting place, we could credit to Millard Gilbertson. As you know, Millard was a great conservationist. He came to one of our meetings one night with maps, pictures to show us of the way the river had changed over the years. He was so amazed at the interest he found in our group that he came back in the next day and told Bev, "I'm going to give you that little red house out in the country for a meeting place." Well, we couldn't turn that down. We accepted it. Told him we'd accept. The next day he came in with an offer of 3 acres of land out there, which we also accepted. Well, we repaired the little building, little house. You can see it. It's a cute little red house out there. Painted it, re-roofed it, cleaned up the yards, and it is incomplete inside, but it is nice to look at, and someday I'm sure it will be used for something. We rented the farmland, and then Millard passed away, and all of the rest of his property went to the Conservation Commission. We didn't feel we could have a museum out in the country, so the Conservation Board bought the land and the house, and we had the money to buy the building down here where we are. It's in the Elgin block, which is a rather unspoiled block of Elgin. It's the building that, our building is historical in itself because it has nearly always been maintained by a grocery store. It was Thomas' store for many, many years that people remember. So we have many things in there that we are real proud of. We have all of the graduation pictures from the Elgin School, and we have put together a book listing all of the graduations, all of the graduates of that school and the history of the school. Then we did one on the Valley School and their graduates by class. So they are handy books to have. Tom and I keep ours handy, if for no other reason that we can decide how old someone is by looking up and seeing when they graduated. We have many things in there that remind us of the school, besides the pictures. We have the school bell mounted in the park with window caps and bricks from the old school. We have one of the school's fireplaces. And on the back, several years ago, some of our members added an addition on the building. It is the brickwork that you see on that addition are bricks from the schoolhouse. And the lovely big double door in the addition is the door from the schoolhouse. Inside we have lots of memorial pieces that tell the story of Elgin's history. These historical societies in these three towns, are very important, and they're worth looking at and helping support. And if you want to know something, it's more likely in there. We have a series of files on the various businesses and events and things that went on in the town in the past. We're trying to promote the Swiss heritage in there with maps and things and books. So we are real happy with what we have and hope that the public will in time come to find it very, very useful. The big project that we have been promoting in the past 3 years now has been done by some of our more ambitious members who spend the year going out, taking pictures of barns and studying the structure and getting books, beautiful books, ready, colored pictures for you to enjoy looking at on the barns of the past. And then they have been promoting a barn tour. And that is getting to be known pretty much all over around northeastern Iowa, and the crowd gets bigger every year. They go out and see these barns and learn about them and take pictures. Last year they had more school buses taking pictures than they had the year before.